Welcome to Gator Bytes, the official business podcast of the Maryland Davies College of Business. I'm your host, Miguel Gomez, and before we begin, we'd like to invite you to follow us on our social media channels at UHDCOB on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and now X. Today, we'll be talking with Dr. Esther Castro. Welcome to the show, Dr. Castro.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, of course. Today, we're going to be talking about finance and you. We're going to be demystifying some complex issues about finance. We're going to get down to the nitty-gritty about what is the story behind the numbers, and we're going to talk about ways to talk about leveling up your career in finance, demystifying some concepts, and applying some daily practical tips to your finances, as well as talking about behavioral finance, the human emotions that go behind it, and we're going to talk about some ghosts of financial crimes past.
Okay, sounds
Yes,
good.
some financial true crimes. So, welcome, Dr. Castro.
Thank you.
So, I'd like to begin. Tell us about yourself and what was your pathway to where we are today? You were a finance professor.
Okay, so I'm from New Orleans. Was there my childhood. I'm a big Saints fan. I think all of my students know that by
Who
now.
dat?
Yeah, who that? And so my parents immigrated from Honduras, and so they actually went to the University of New Orleans, and my dad studied finance. And I think that was probably the beginning. It's funny because I don't think a lot of people did the way my parents did growing up, of like, if we would go on a trip, instead of paying for our stuff, they would make us budget before going on a trip, and then that would be the money they gave us, and then if we didn't have any money, then we would have to go on the dollar menu for McDonald's, and that's all we had left. So I think just kind of early on, that was an important aspect of my upbringing, and just kind of went along when I went to a small private university called Laterno University, and I did the student organizations there. I did the finance student organizations that kind of helped me get more involved in that. I did an internship. It's now Wells Fargo, but back then it was called Wachovia Investment Bank. And so I did my internship there, and then worked out when I graduated in banking, and then I even set up a tax business for the Hispanic community, and decided to go back to grad school, just being encouraged by others, and went to the University of New Orleans. And so that's kind of my pathway. From there I came here, and that's kind of how I am where I am now.
I love to hear that. And funny enough, I actually just got back from New Orleans, so this all comes full circle.
Yes, great city.
No, so having all that experience and being now where you are as a professor, we want to break down to our audience the meaning of finance. It can be a very big and complex topic, and sometimes people can sort of tune out, but I want to be able to explain, why is finance important to our recent business graduates, and how does it play in terms of from when they're hired to when they're managing and running departments?
Yeah. So I feel like a lot of times, especially when I get students and they get really intimidated when they come into my class, and especially if they're not finance students. Every single time I tell people, oh yeah, I teach finance, they're like, oh, you must really like numbers. And I mean, I like numbers.
Yes.
And yes, numbers have a big part in finance, but really there is another significant portion in finance that a lot of people kind of don't think about, and that is what to do with those numbers, and critical thinking of, like, when you see numbers, what are your thoughts about those numbers, and what are you going to do with those numbers? Decision making is a big part of finance. And so a lot of people kind of don't realize that portion of finance, and those are important aspects that you need to know even going into your career. And so in my classes, I actually ask a lot of times students to read the Wall Street Journal. And I encourage that for anybody who is going to be going into an interview. Hey, read the Wall Street Journal. In your interview, I think it will look good if you knew how those concepts could impact your future employer. And so knowing that, even in the business world, I think goes a long way to showing that you care, right? At the same time, we do talk about the numbers. If you're in a company, look at their financials. Where is the financial position that company's at? I think it's good to know the big picture. This is the big picture the company is at, financially, and then that will help you understand your own role in that company, and maybe ways to kind of improve your company in that way. and then hopefully you will get into that manager position. I think if you show that you care and you show that you know what is the big picture is and what your role is in that big picture, getting into that manager position may be a little bit easier that way. And then you're making decisions. So it's all about, well, how will your decision impact that company financially? Even if you're not in a financial role, you still need to know how your decision, maybe your marketing decision, how that is going to impact the company financially. Knowing maybe you're going to have to argue and try to find budgets. You need to know, well, if you have that as an argument, hey, what I'm going to do is going to improve your company financially. That's a good way to have some good evidence for what you're wanting to back, either decision-wise or budget-wise.
You know, everything you just said is definitely true, and more so the reading of the Wall Street Journal. For example, just being aware of what's happening in the world and in markets gives you an insight as to how it impacts industries, especially if you're trying to go into an industry that affects prices in terms of commodities. You better know what's going on in the markets, whether it's up, it's down. Right. And more so now, it also plays into the human element, into decision making in finance and in business. And I'd like to go ahead and ask you about that. Emotions are at the core of the human experience, and part of that is you can't separate the numbers from the emotions. So tell us a little bit about behavioral finance, and what role do emotions play alongside the numbers and figures in a publicly traded company?
Yeah, I think that is more and more becoming important, and we're seeing even in our schools of talking about behavioral finance. You know, in traditional finance, it's all about, we're saying these are the factors that impact prices are things like your earning potential, or a lot of times we like to talk about the capital asset pricing model, and I'm pretty sure every finance student has heard that before. And a big assumption is that investors are rational. And as we know, that's
not the
not
case.
Realistic, right? It's not realistic for us to be rational. And so a lot of times we do have those fears and regrets. And so I think it's good to know that like all prices, a stock price is all about supply and demand, right? And so kind of going back to that economics, it's simply supply and demand. And I think we could see in a couple years ago, right, the meme stocks.
Yeah.
We had GameStop, we had AMC, and those prices didn't reflect the true worth of that company.
No.
So it kind of took the traditional finance right outside the door, and instead what really impacted was just kind of like a herding effect. Reddit said, hey, look, check out these, brought attention to GameStop, and now everybody was kind of going in and buying it. And so it wasn't because of the worth of the company, it was because they had the fear of missing out. They wanted to flock to it because everyone else was doing it. It's a herding effect, right? So I think it's important to know that happens, and a lot of times it's a short-term effect, right? And so also knowing that, I think even like COVID showed us, March 2020, the stock market plummeted. And I think that was based on fear. Everyone was afraid, COVID is a real thing. Pandemic is now, it's officially a pandemic. And so we saw people doing these things that if they would have stopped for a second to think, wait, this is a short-term effect, it's not long-term, they would have realized they should have just stayed with it instead of just selling out. What we saw is a lot of rational investors actually go in and buy, right? They saw it was low, they're going to go in and buy. And that's really what it is. It's trying to have that cool, common effect and thinking, well, let's think rationally. But yes, emotions are part of it. I know that I have my own biases when it comes to investing that it's good to be aware of. So I made my mistakes with some of these biases, some of my emotions, and then, okay, let's not do this again and learn from it. Because yes, like you said, the stock market doesn't always behave rational. But I think in the long term, you do see some rationality. You will see like in 2020, the stock market bounced back. And so in the end, you do see a lot of rationality, but in the short term, knowing, hey, let's kind of put some of my emotions aside and think about the long-term effect.
That is so fascinating because time is often perceived that it's linear. It's something that is both present, and at the same time it's distant. And in terms of being able to think logically about a portfolio, it's very tempting to buy low and sell high, and you take advantage of a situation. But at the same time, you have to realize that's not necessarily the case when you look at the foundation of what do these actually businesses produce in terms of value, in terms of the products. AMC had empty theater seats, but at the same time, the stock was going up and up. Peloton, they were hoping that they could ride that bicycle into the future, but at the same time, we know that people eventually went back to their traditional gyms. So it's about having that long-term perspective in terms of analyzing the risks and the benefits. That's something that we learned in your finance class, full disclosure. Money is often a very big motivator factor in terms of what motivates people to make moves in the market. And I want to ask you a hard-hitting question. We talked about behavioral finance, but more often than not, we think back to names such as Enron, WorldCom, and even Lehman Brothers. These were once shining examples in the corporate space, but now when you say their names, they're reviled. So my question to you is, what role does ethics play in finance, and what advice would you have to future business graduates in terms of navigating questionable or potentially unethical situations in their finance and banking careers?
Yeah, and so, I mean, you were in one of my finance class, and I'm not going to quiz you right now, but one of the first things we talked about, right, was what is the main objective of a financial manager? And we said it was to maximize shareholder value.
Right.
And a lot of times that is something that we took on for the rest of that class period. And really, we don't really focus on ethics. Right, and a lot of people use that objective and say, this is my excuse to do unethical things, right? We're gonna, maybe, cook the books a little bit, and we're going to hide some losses, because that way it won't hurt the shareholders. Hopefully we'll do better later on. All with that thought of maybe we're helping the shareholders, but you're right, ethics is important, and that's why we have a lot of regulatory bodies that kind of provide some of those standards for us. And as somebody who's going to be working in the industry, it's really their responsibility to look at those ethics, know what those standards are, and then even to look at what are the regulations in their own industry, right? Each industry may have different regulations, and so knowing what are the regulations for those industry. One of those things that you have to do is, if you see something, say something, right? If you see something that's unethical, then report it to your supervisor, to the HR, to whoever you need to report it to the SEC, even if it's that big, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that those names that you called, Enron, WorldCom, those are good examples, right, for us to go back and remember. Like, you don't want to be on the bad end of that. You don't want to be reviled and remembered, or have the jail time. And so, hey, let's act ethically so we won't be on that end. And so I think that it's very telling, right, when a company is not acting ethically. And so I think it is important to step up and have that responsibility.
That's very sobering, because this is something that still continues to this day. All we got to look back is just a few months, and we're looking at Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX. So it's something that is a continuing challenge to the profession, but at the same time, from what you told us, it seems as though honesty is your best policy, and that's what leads to a prosperous long-term career in finance. Ultimately, the truth always comes out.
It always comes out.
You can't hide behind the numbers. The numbers do not lie.
Right.
Yes.
So many people are looking at them, so you might as well be truthful, like you say, honest.
Of course. All right. Well, I have my next question, and I'd like to go ahead and ask you. The main idea that people have of finance is, more often than not, they think about careers in Wall Street, careers with big investment banks. But there's another side of careers in finance when it comes to regulatory and financial enforcement, such as with the Securities and Exchange Commission and even the IRS. Can you tell us a little bit about potential pathways that students might have in those areas, and why it's important to think about these careers as a different avenue in terms of maybe finding a good fit culture-wise? Because sometimes people aren't all about the money. Sometimes people who go into finance might have different ideas of what their careers looks like.
Yeah. The government, they always have some jobs available for everybody, including those who want to be in the finance realm. And so I remember always seeing like the FBI asking for people who also wanted someone in the finance industry, and the IRS, and like you said, the SEC, they need people who are auditing, right? Who are making sure that those big corporations are doing what they are supposed to be doing, right? And they're checking up on them. And I think that especially for people who want to be a part of the policy, right? That's a good fit of, hey, let's go to the SEC because we want to actually make an impact in financial markets. The best place to do that is with the government, and the best place to do that is with the SEC or the Treasury, because they have their their hand in that pulse of like, let's impact the financial markets for good. Let's protect investors. And so I think for those people who want to make an impact in that way, maybe it's not about the money, like you said, but they want to maybe protect others. That is a good route to do it. You will definitely have some job security there. You'll definitely have some good benefits. Maybe you won't have the pay, but you will have a lot of career growth as well. And so I think that is a good route to go to.
So, Dr. Castro, I'd like to go ahead and just ask you the next question.
Okay.
In this economy, like everyone's been saying, finance is already complex at the corporate level, but let's bring it down to the day-to-day. Let's simplify this. What are some practical day-to-day advice that you would give to people in terms of protecting their investments and their bank accounts in terms of inflation and against a potential future recession down the line?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first step is always to kind of look at what financial position you are in, right? And so obviously inflation is, eroding a lot of your net cash flows. And so looking into your own cash flow statements, seeing what's coming in and what's going out, and then maybe, trimming that down if necessary, especially if you're about to graduate and that, you're going to have to start paying student loans. Okay, so what are some things that need to kind of get out so that you can start paying your student loans? You should always pay off your debt. All of your credit card balance, I think, are really important. When it comes to a lot of inflation and thinking of investing in those types of assets, I think really the best safe way are, some of your hard assets that aren't really hit by inflation that much. And so real estate. And so I can tell just from my own house and how the value has increased of my house. That is a good thing, right, about having inflation up is my house value is also up.
Right.
But also thinking about different types, the gold, different types of commodity that also can increase. And then, the Treasury also have your TIPS, your Treasury Inflation and Protection Securities. And so this kind of is a security, a bond that their interest rates will fluctuate with the inflation. And so that's another good way also to kind of protect yourself from inflation. Obviously, knowing that even though inflation has gone down, we see gas prices have gone up, and gas price is going to impact other prices, knowing that, hey, this is something that I have to also be aware of even in my own budget, and also your different types of investments. So I think those are some good ways that you can protect from inflation and at least be ready for it.
Right. Right. It sounds like just building a diversified portfolio and taking into account risk is a good way to at least start to protect yourself against these volatilities in the market.
Yeah.
You don't know when the price is going to go up or down, but at the same time, if you spread out the risk, it sounds from what you're saying that you're setting yourself up for success.
Exactly. When it comes to investment, you always want to have a diversified portfolio. And so with inflation, you have those specific things that can help, looking at their REITs and things like that. But yes, you should always have a diversified portfolio for sure.
Wow. Well, we're coming up on time, and we have just last question for you. It's a two-parter.
Okay.
So the first part is, we know that you're involved on campus with a student organization called the Financial Management Association. You're their academic advisor. What got you involved on student campus in terms of being able to help this organization grow? And the last part is, what tips or advice would you have to recent or future business graduates in terms of being able to find a job in finance or banking? And what are some ways to stand out in terms of your portfolio, your resume, and what are some possible ways to start in terms of getting that experience to get your foot in the door?
Okay. Wow, that's a lot. So the FMA, the Financial Management Association, is definitely a good way to kind of pad that resume and grow in a lot of different areas. Like I said previously, I was part of a student organization when I was in college, and I feel like what you learn are some soft skills that maybe you didn't learn when you were in the classroom. And so you learn a lot about communication. Especially if you're an active member and you take on a leadership role, you are learning leadership roles and some of those emotional intelligence that I think employers really look at. A lot of times employers aren't just looking at your what you did, your scores, your GPA, but they want to see, hey, are you going to be a good part of our team? Are you going to be someone I actually want to work with?
Right.
And so having worked with other people in these organizations, and these are really student run, and our leadership in our FMA, they are thinking of a lot of different opportunities, bringing in banks, having the SEC. They're thinking of all of these things, and they're growing in those skills. And so I think that is something that employers look for. They're like, okay, they've worked in a team, they have a lot of initiative, and that's something you can get from not necessarily just sitting in the classroom, but by actively participating in these student organizations. So that is definitely a good way to, I think, attract employers. And I know that being part of different organizations and going to the conferences and doing these things, I think, look really, really good. And so, and then, looking at all the resources that UHD has. And so I know that UHD, the Career Center, always have all these good events every semester, and they just had their career fair, and it was one of those things where they have all of these employers come. Why don't students go and actually take advantage of that and put their foot in the door and, do their resume, get their resume checked, do the mock interview. I think all of these are good preparations for career that they should take advantage of. I think it will help them calm them down when they go to the interview process, because they've done something already similar, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that those are some good resources. I talked about the Wall Street Journal, and I say my students, that's one thing I put on the syllabus. I give them the link. I was like, here's the UHD library link. Go access the Wall Street Journal. People pay for it. You get to have it for free. The library has other financial data sources that you can also look at, and so there's a lot of things I think that can prepare you for a career. I think it's just students being aware of it and then actually doing it. It might take time from their schedule. Especially if you're kind of an introverted person, it might take your energy, and but you have to do it, right? You have to take that shot. You have to put that step forward to really get to the career you want to be in.
And as they say in finance, this will pay dividends down the line.
Yes, for sure.
Well, Dr. Castro, thank you so much for joining us today on this episode of Gator Bytes. Thank you for making dollars and cents of all of this complex topics. My name is Miguel Gomez. I've been your host. Our producers have been Victor Henson, Ricardo Saint Serin Duran. Our set designer was Evangelina Vasquez. Follow us on social media at UHDCOB on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, X, if you are getting technical about it. And remember to take a bite out of business. We'll see y'all later, Gators.